And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's forecast showing a couple of systems affecting the state here. The first one out here in the west, bringing snow and blowing snow into the west coast there up to the Bering Strait, western Seward Peninsula. And the other one here spreading rain in across the southeast coast, becoming rain and snow along the North Gulf Coast, mostly snow, Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula, all light though. And for tomorrow, rain along the North Gulf Coast and all of the southeast coast, right on down through Dixon Entrance. Dry central eastern interior, snow and blowing snow, winter storm warnings and blizzard warnings out and advisories from Bristol Bay all the way up in toward the Seward Peninsula here. And then for Thursday, that whole mess shifts eastward here, bringing a lot of moisture into the central and trying to put moisture into the eastern interior north of the Alaska Range. There's a high wind warning out for the Alaska Range for winds gusting to 80 miles an hour. Otherwise, look for rain here, especially in the afternoon for southern Alaska. Extending eastward to about Yakutat, southeast coast, so not too bad. Mostly dry with an isolated shower or two, and about the same thing here for the Aleutians. Coastal water forecast for the south coast, southeast winds 25 knots, north coast east at 25. Lynn Canal, south 15, Stevens Passage, southeast winds 15 knots, and small craft advisories for Clarence Strait, southeast at 25. And then for the inside channels here, light variable winds at about 10 knots for Thursday with seas down to 2 feet, and northwest to northeast winds 15 knots for the south coast, central coast, west 15 to 20 knots, and the north coast, south to southwest, 10 to 20 knots. Cook Inlet tomorrow, north winds 10 knots, northeast at 10 for Prince William Sound, east-northeast at 15 to 20 for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, for the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, winds will be northwest at 15 knots. And then for Thursday, small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, south winds or south to southwest winds 25 knots, south 25 for Kamishak Bay, south winds 30 knots for the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories south at 25, Prince William Sound, southeast winds 20 knots, seas at about 3 feet, and for the eastern North Gulf Coast, winds will be south at 20 knots. Kodiak Island, north to northeast winds at 15 to 20 knots for Wednesday. Variable winds at 15 for Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And for Thursday, for the Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest winds 20 to 30 knots, and 25 knot southwest winds for Bristol Bay with seas up to 6 feet. Kodiak Island, south winds 25 to 30 knots with 7-foot seas. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, actually the central eastern Aleutians here from Adak all the way down to Alaska, southwest winds 35 to 45 knots, and storm warnings here for the western Aleutians, southwest winds 45 to 50 knots. And then for Thursday, Kiska to Shemya, west at 35, and for Amchitka Island, 35 to 40 knot winds out of the west. And for Adak and Atka, eastward here to Unalaska, west winds 30, maybe up to 35 knots. And for the southwest coast, gale warnings tomorrow, south 40 knots here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, Yukon Delta coast, southwest at 35. And gale warnings also for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, southeast at 35 knots, southwest 45 knots for the Pribilof Islands there, with seas just under 20 feet, south at 40 knots, 17-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. And for Thursday, St. Paul, St. George, southwest winds 40 knots, seas now at 25 feet there, northwest 30 knots behind that trough with 18-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. Good southwest wind at 30 knots right into the southwest coast and St. Lawrence Island, turning south at 30 knots in Norton Sound. Eastern Boulevard Sea coast, east winds 15 knots tomorrow, southeast at 20 on the central coast, then back to east at 15 for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea. Gale warnings, east to southeast winds at 35 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea on Thursday, anywhere from south to northeast winds here at 25 to 30 knots. Southeast winds at 20 knots for the Arctic coast.